Sometimes I think about what's hard to change on a particular farm or ranch, what's easy to change. You know, you can't change the weather where you live, right? You can't change, well, within reason, you can't change the topography of where you live. You can't change the soil types on your place. Now, we can modify them by increasing organic matter in the soil or something, but you can't really change the soil type. You look at it and there's several things that you just can't really change. You know what the easiest thing to change on a ranch is? The livestock. You could sell out everything you have tomorrow and buy back something completely different the next day. It's very easy to change the livestock on the ranch. It's harder to change all the aspects of the land. One of the main things that we're trying to manage on a ranch, we have carrying capacity, which is the ability of your ranch to produce feed. That's the supply side of the supply and demand equation. Stocking rate is the number of animals we actually put out there. So carrying capacity, to an extent, is inherent to the land. It is the capacity of your land to produce feed. Now, through our management choices, we change what that carrying capacity is. Stocking rate, on the other hand, that is simply a choice we make. That's the demand that we're going to put on our feed resource. So this is really a basic supply and demand relationship. The land is your capacity to supply. Your choice in livestock is the demand that you're going to put on it. When we think about profit, it's a very simple concept. Income minus costs. You have two sides to the profitability equation, just like we have two sides of supply and demand. Profitability, we have income and we have costs. And in general, the more animals you have on the place, the higher the stocking rate, the greater the revenue stream is going to be. So increasing stocking rate will increase your revenue stream. Another aspect of stocking rate, it's a primary determinant of individual animal performance. And we're going to explore this a little bit deeper. And it says, especially if optimal carrying capacity is exceeded, then we see a decline in the individual performance. This is the basic relationship. As we increase animal number, individual performance is going to decline, but only after a point. And again, we'll illustrate this in a moment. Production per acre will increase up to a point, but at some point, we no longer are increasing our output per acre. And I know as livestock producers, we tend to measure things as calf weaning weight, percent cows bred, average daily gain on yearlings. We put a lot of measurements of productivity onto the animal. What we don't think nearly enough about is our productivity per acre, because it's a land-based business. Now, this relationship between increasing stocking rate and increasing performance is commonly expressed by something they call the Mott curves. Gerald Mott is the guy who first drew this out. He was an American pasture researcher, worked from the 1940s to about 1990 when he passed away. But there's two lines on here, the red line being gain per head. So we're going to increase stocking rate. Now, start out thinking, we have 40 acres and we're going to put one steer out there. That one steer has the opportunity to take just the very best bite of feed that's out there, and every bite's going to be a big mouthful. So that one animal performs very well. But because we only have one animal on 40 acres, our gain per acre is quite low. We put another animal out there, 2 animals on 40 acres, and being here in eastern Kansas, maybe I should have started from 10 acres, not 40 acres. But we put 2 animals out there, and they still both can selectively graze and do very well. So our gain per acre doubles because we put twice as many animals out there. And we can add, another animal, but at some point, those animals are going to start to compete with one another for that best bite of feed. And when they do that, their average daily gain is going to start to decline. Now, Mott, when he drew this out, basically said where those 2 lines intersect is the optimum stocking rate. So he said that was the optimum stocking rate where those lines intersect. Well, you can draw these lines different ways and maybe it moves around, but said it always comes back to where the balance between individual performance and gain per acre intersect. I mean, this is just beautiful theory, ivory tower stuff, and yeah, you write papers about it and you get to be famous and all that. You get the whole idea named after you. The tragedy is Mott was wrong. That is not the economic stocking rate or the optimum stocking rate. The economic optimum is actually at a different location. And it is just before we maximize gain per acre. What type of assets is your money invested in? And if we look at the typical ranch, especially if you own the land ownership, land lease payments, property taxes, those are all land related, aren't they? We seed an acre, we fertilize an acre, we put fence around acres, we develop stock water across acres. If we're irrigating, weed control, almost any of these other things, we are doing something to the land. Now let's think about your equipment. Do you plow a cow? No, you plow an acre. Do you swath a cow? No, you swath an acre. Do you bale cows? No, you bale hay off of acres. And if we then were to list out animal assets, well, that would be ownership of the animal itself. Now, the equipment that we specifically use for animals, a stock trailer, portable corral, scale, and what about feeders, mineral feeders, hay feeders? Now, if we have a hay processor that we're using to feed hay out to a cow, that becomes an animal-based asset, even though it's a piece of equipment. And so some portion of our tractor we can assign to the animal enterprise. But when all is said and done, on a typical ranch, 3 to 5 times more of your money is invested in the land and land-based assets, not in animals. Now, with the high value of cows right now, if you are to look at your inventory value, the equity that you might have, because cow prices are so high right now, this relationship shrinks from probably that 5 times to 3 times. But by and large, most of us, year after year after year, have way more invested in our land resources and the equipment we use on the land than we do in the livestock. And hence, if you're defining profitability as return on assets or investment or equity, you better be focused on getting return from where most of your money is. And so at 5 times as much invested in land as in animals, that's over 80% of your assets. And if you say, oh, to be profitable, I want to have 6% annual return on investments, well, you better be focused on 6% coming off of that 80% of your investment in land, not so much the livestock. And we're back to the easiest thing to change about any ranch is the animals on it. we need to get more out of every acre. It isn't getting more out of every cow or every ewe or every yearling. It's we need to get more out of every acre. Another way of saying that is we need to cost effectively increase the carrying capacity of our ranch. And if we can cost effectively increase the carrying capacity of our ranch, then our potential stocking rate does in fact go up. But you can't just increase stocking rate to try to have more animals and more money if the land will not support it. So if you don't know who Burke Teichert he's not dead. He was vice president of operations for the entire Deseret ranch system. Deseret being the land and cattle and all of that owned by the Mormon Church. And they have ranches all over the country, actually all over the world. But if we just think about the U.S., if you put all of their land holdings and all of their animals together, Deseret is by far the biggest ranching operation in the United States. And it's also one of the most profitable ranching businesses that I've ever, been associated with. And there were two individuals, Burke Teichert and Greg Simon, and they're the ones who in the 1990s basically took Deseret from being a black hole money pit for the Mormon Church to being very profitable ranching businesses. So Burke Teichert knows a whole lot about what makes ranches profitable. First one is carrying capacity. And basically he's talking about cost effectively increasing the carrying capacity of the ranch. And he does emphasize that we need to be measuring return per acre, not return per head. Looking at return per head, and in my first 10 years at the University of Missouri, that's pretty well what we looked at, was return per head. And we have had what was really a false sense of understanding of what drives profitability in the livestock business. But we were looking at the wrong aspect. So he talks about increasing carrying capacity cost effectively. Grazed feed versus fed feed, so stockpile versus hay. And the benchmark in Deseret is no more than 15% of the days of the year can you afford to feed hay. Well, that's about 55 days. So basically, he's saying you cannot afford to feed hay any more than 2 months of the year and expect to be profitable in the cow-calf business. So no more than 15% of the year do you feed hay. And interestingly enough, Dallas Mount, who runs the Ranching for Profit schools, the benchmark in Ranching for Profit is 60 days. Breeding females, they've got a very predictable cyclic demand for both quantity of feed and quality of feed. And so this graph here, I'm not saying you should calve in January. It's just easy to look at a calendar January through December. So these bars here, this is the average daily forage intake requirement for this particular cow. Now, this example is a approximately 1,300 pound cow of moderate to superior milking ability. And I use this one as the starting point because it illustrates, all right, so this calf is being born 1st of January. And so for about 60 days, we have rising feed demand because the cow is increasing her lactation. The first day the calf is born, she has X amount of milk. And then over the next 45 to 75 days, that incrementally increases as she comes to peak lactation. So at peak lactation, this high milk producing beef cow, and 1,300 pounds these days is a small cow. When we actually did this milking, that was a large cow. So, but 43 pounds of forage per day is what she's consuming at peak lactation. Now, Peak lactation, as I said, generally comes kind of 45 to 75 days post-calving. At 90 days of age, that's basically when a calf switches from being milk dependent to being forage dependent. So milk availability before 3 months of age is the important time frame in a calf's life. Beyond 3 months of age, it's much less important because the calf is eating way more forage and becomes forage dependent at that point. So the cow's demand is falling off after peak lactation. We're going to wean the calf there around 1st of August, and that is when the cow's nutritional requirement is the lowest. And for this particular cow, it's 23 pounds of forage a day. So there is an 80% change in energy demand from when she's a non-lactating mid-gestation cow to peak lactation. Another way of saying that is if on this day you have 100 cows, on this day you have the equivalent of 180 cows. That's how much more forage demand your herd is putting on your resources. Now, if we have this cow calving in January and this is March, you might have some green grass coming around, in March here, but a whole lot of the country does not have, grass coming at that, green grass coming at that time. So this does not match up with the forage supply very well. So because our highest energy demand occurs calving to rebreeding, we would like that to coincide with when our available pasture or range is at its peak. So this graph here overlays the blue bar is January 15th calving. The orange bar is May 15th calving. So basically calving in the snow, calving on green grass. And then we have percent of body weight intake. If we start with the winter calving cow, the peak demand is over 3% of body weight a day, and it's occurring there in February and March. So again, typically when we do not have low-cost green feed around. And then the decline in demand is taking place while our pastures are coming into their most productive stage. And we end up weaning that calf, kind of a late summer situation. We look at the May 15th calving, and she's a mid-gestation, non-lactating cow through these winter months. And so we have our lowest demand occurring when we are at our lowest feed supply position. And then she's going to peak. If the calf's May 15th, the peak's going to be there late June and July when we have ample forage supply. Taper off through mid to late summer. But remember that calf demand is increasing at this time when we have that feed supply. Now, if you look back to the winter calving cow, her peak is above 3% of body weight. The summer calving cow, it's below 3% of body weight. That's that difference in winter cold stress increasing the demand. So not only are we having higher demand because of lactation, we also have higher demand that time of year because of the cold conditions. Now, these two graphs here are for 11 to 1,200 pound cows of low to moderate milking ability. So more of a traditional range type cow compared to the one we saw in the previous slide. The difference at the 11 to 1,200 pound range, winter calving versus summer calving, is about half a ton of additional forage per year for the winter calving cow. Now, as the cow's weight increases and her milking ability increases, that difference between overall annual feed demand steadily increases. So if you take like a 1,500-pound cow of moderate milking ability, the difference in total feed demand of the winter calving cow versus the summer calving cow is about a ton of feed. What if you go to a 1,700-pound cow, which some of your neighbors have, of superior milking ability? Now we're looking at a 1.5 tons difference in feed requirement across the year. That becomes a very big difference. So matching the forage and livestock resources is an important part of ranch profitability, because it can so significantly change what the feed requirements are. And I don't say calve in sync with nature. I say calve in sync with your feed supply. So if we look at native rangelands, let's go down to southeast Texas, down on the Gulf Coast. Cold day in the winter, it's 50 degrees. The annual ryegrass never stops growing. The oats don't ever stop growing. There's green feed, throughout the winter. And then you think about how bad their native warm season grasses are nutritionally once you get past early summer. And you think, well, what is the best forage we're going to have? And it is that annual ryegrass that's going to be out there in February and March. And this is our son in Texas. He's near Hillsboro, Texas now, but his first several years in Texas, he was on a place that was a little more southeast Texas. And this was basically the 1st of April. And, coming from Idaho on the 1st of April, where you're still waiting for the snow to melt off, to go to knee-high green grass, it's kind of a shock. But March, like I said, basically from February 15th to April 15th is pretty well the best grass they're ever going to have in that part of Texas. And it makes perfect sense to calve in January there. Everywhere else we're going to say, calving in January, that's crazy. It's going to mess up your, supply and demand of cheap feed relationship. This is not natural. Annual ryegrass is not native to North America or Texas. This is an unnatural system. Humans have modified what the feed supply is, and this is why I say don't calve in sync with nature, calve in sync with your forage supply. Now, I know we're not really to the fescue-dominated part of Kansas over here at Salina, but you go over, the Flint Hills, and you do that strip between the Missouri border and the east side of the Flint Hills, and there's a lot of fescue in that country, and mostly it's endophyte-infected fescue, so it's the old toxic fescue. And toxicity of fescue is most severe in late spring and early summer. It is least severe in the winter. Unlike most cool season grasses, tall fescue actually has its highest nutrient concentration in the fall, not in the spring. The primary, one of the primary effects of fescue toxicity is heat stress in the cattle. And so when does it get hot in Kansas? Oh, by May and June, it can already be pretty hot. When is it cooler? In the wintertime. So in this case, if this is your primary base forage, and it says Kentucky there because next week I'll be talking about this in Kentucky. So fall calving, if you are in an endophyte-infected tall fescue environment, fall calving is probably the best choice in calving date you can make, and that is, of course, diametrically opposite of calving in sync with nature. So even though on native rangeland, I'm all about, that green grass calving and late May and June, primarily in June, it is not the universal answer everywhere to go to June calving. You got to look at what your resources are and see how they match up. So this next one, you think I would have learned this in elementary school or something, but it took me most of my life to learn. Water makes grass grow. When we lived in Missouri, our average annual rainfall was 38 to 40 inches. Where we moved to in Idaho, the natural precipitation is 7 to 8 inches. But we have the magic of center pivot irrigation. And you can, for the 19 growing seasons that we were on the ranch in Idaho, basically I put down 3/4 of an inch of water every 3 days, 24/7. And it is amazing when you can make it rain like that, how consistently and how good a quality of pasture you can grow. So in Missouri, when we sold our farm there and left, we were carrying a cow and her calf, typically 8 months on the cow. We could do that on 2.05 acres, 365 days of the year, made no hay, fed no hay. 2 acres. We did pretty well. Now, after having gone to Idaho and worked on one extreme with the center pivot irrigation, and on the other extreme, desert rangeland at 7 to 8 inch annual precipitation, I learned way more about water management than I ever even considered when we lived in Missouri. And I'm confident that, I could go back to that same farm in Missouri and run that cow-calf pair on no more than 1.5 acres year-round. And at 2 acres year-round, we were more than double the kind of conventional stocking rate in our area. And I realized how much water I wasted because I didn't have enough litter cover, because I didn't always leave appropriate post-grazing residual. I allowed a lot of water to be lost from our farm that now I'm pretty sure I know how to keep that in place, get more water into the soil, hold more water into the soil. And it's largely because I worked on 2 extremes away from what Missouri was. Now, the amount of water that we put on irrigated pasture in combination with the natural precipitation level in Idaho, that's actually less total inches a year than the 38, 40 that was our natural rainfall. It was all about distribution that made it more. So this is kind of a busy table, and we're not going to go to the whole thing. But this is a standard table for predicting forage yield based on precipitation regime. And I think, it says 32 to 42 degree latitude. There's tables available for different latitudes. An inch of water in the north grows more than an inch of water will in the south. And that has to do with mostly evaporative water loss. And then in the south, the nighttime temperatures not cooling off like they do at more northerly latitudes. So an inch of water, like south of 32 degrees, let's go down, somewhere south of where I-40 goes across Oklahoma. Let's go south of there. An inch of water might do good to grow, 200 pounds of forage per acre. Get up in this mid-latitude, and it might be 300 pounds of forage per inch of water. Up in where we are at 45 degrees, we were just under 45 degrees north latitude. You know, an inch of water might grow 400 pounds of forage. And you get up into central Alberta or British Columbia in the summertime. Now, also remember that they got 18 hours of sunlight. You know, when you get up that far north, that inch of water might grow 500 pounds of forage per inch. So there is that factor of inch of water grows more in the north than it does in the south. But here we have that increasing amount of water in the environment. That might be natural rainfall or the combination of irrigation and natural rainfall. The real point I want you to see here is with each additional inch of water, the yield per inch of water also increases. It's a situation of the rich get richer, the poor stay poorer. So as we get more rain, or I should say more effective precipitation or water into the soil, the greater the productivity of every inch of water becomes. But through this increasing, from the 15 to 30, you're right on target there. Some of these, like the next increment, and I think is 42 to 47 degrees, might be 49, 42 to 49. The table only goes up to 30 inches because there's not enough days in the growing season to use any more water than that. The other thing that I want to point out is the appropriate utilization for this moisture regime. At lower levels of water, we have a lower seasonal utilization target. As the amount of water increases, that utilization target goes up. So what it's also saying is the more grass that you grow, the higher percentage of that annual production that you can count on actually grazing and harvesting with livestock. And my experience after many years in the West is that 40% is actually too high. So evapotranspiration, that's the combined water use of transpiration, which is plant metabolic process. So I'll often say transpiration grows cow food. Evaporation is the direct loss of water, from the soil surface or off, not from the plant canopy, but off the plant canopy. Evaporation does not grow cow feed. If we keep the soil, covered and cooler, the majority of water use is via transpiration, and that is growing more forage. The direct water loss is pretty minor. If, on the other hand, we allow things to dry out and be uncovered, the majority of water simply evaporates away and is not used by the plants. So carrying capacity, back to this picture, this contrast here. The upper limit of carrying capacity is set by your environment, and that is primarily related to water. Yeah, length of the growing season, temperature regime, soil conditions are factors, that affect what your carrying capacity is going to be. But by far and away, the overriding factor is simply how much water do you get. It is how, so that's the upper limit potential is set by growing conditions. How much you actually harvest of the potential, or actually how much you grow of the potential, that depends entirely on your daily grazing management decisions. And this is why we can see properties side by side that might have 200 to 300% differences in carrying capacity. It's the same environment, but it's difference in management strategies. So the more effectively that we manage grazing, the more organic matter we can build into the soil. If you want to increase the water holding capacity of a sandy soil, how do you do it? You increase organic matter. If you want to increase the infiltration of water in a clay soil, how do you do it? You increase organic matter. And so managing your grazing, and I rarely ever say maximize in my talks. I'm usually optimize, optimize, optimize. The one thing that I have seen that I can't find anything wrong with maximizing, having a goal of maximizing, is photosynthesis. The more photosynthesis we can do on every acre, the more productive we make that soil at every level. All right, so building an effective water cycle, the basic criteria are maintain vegetative cover, maintain appropriate litter layer on the soil, balance use and recovery appropriate to that environment. You know, sometimes people ask me, well, how long should the recovery period be? And you know what I tell them, don't you? It depends. Of course, it depends on the environment, on the season of the year. You know, you can't say, well, you got to have 30 days recovery, or you got to have 50 days of recovery. You got to have 100 days of recovery, because it depends. Sometimes it's as, little as 20 to 25. Sometimes it's months, 15 months. Sometimes it's a couple of years. It depends. If we are doing these things, we will build organic matter. And that is a huge, huge piece of the more effective water cycle, avoid animal concentration points, and avoid soil compaction. That's how we build functional water cycles. Time management matters more than spatial management. And it's interesting that this is something I learned over 45 years. One of the very first books that I ever read on grazing management, when I started, because I grew up a crop and hog farmer. I didn't grow up in the cattle business. One of the first books that I read on grazing management when I started grad school was Grass Productivity by Andre Voisin. And I maybe didn't take it seriously enough from the outset because it was so different from anything else I'd heard or read about grazing management. But Andre Voisin, he's one who really wrote about the importance of time-based management rather than spatial management. And it took me a while to realize that, basically everything I was seeing and learning through my years in research from operating our own farm there in Missouri, it all, just kept coming back to, oh, that's what Voisin said. So time management, why the time matters more than space. And these next few slides, I think, are the most direct explanation of why we want short grazing periods and long growing periods. So each grazing cycle has those two time periods, and emphasize they're periods of time. Grazing, when the pasture is actually exposed to animals eating on it. The recovery period, when it is not, when animals are not present. During the grazing period, mostly negative things are happening to the plants and soil, because animals like to eat leaves, because that's the most nutritious part of the plant and the tastiest part of the plant. So once they start biting leaves off, photosynthesis goes down. If photosynthesis on the top of the plant is being diminished, root growth slows down, may stop. And so we're contracting the root system. We have stopped or reduced direct energy flow to soil microbes. And if soil compaction is going to happen into a pasture, it is caused by animals being out there walking around. So those are all negative happenings during the grazing period. On the positive side, we do have nutrients being returned to the soil via dung and urine. So that fertilization that's taking place is a positive. So very simply, if we make our grazing periods shorter and shorter and shorter, we have fewer days in the growing season that negative things are happening to the plants. In the recovery period, these are mostly positive things happening. Leaves start regrowing, so photosynthesis is kicking up again. If we have more photosynthesis on top of the plant, we can regrow the root system. We've restored the direct energy feeding to the soil microbes. Nutrients are being released from feces. So mostly positive things are happening. So we say, okay, we make recovery periods longer. We have more days of the year that positive things are happening in the pasture. Now, the duration of the recovery period, just like stocking rate, that's a choice that we make. And we might make them too short, we might make them too long. We need to be adjusting them based on the growing conditions, at that point in the season. So recovery periods do need to be variable in length. We don't want them to become excessive. This graph here, we have increasing number of paddocks or pasture subdivisions across here, percent of days in the growing season where the plants are in recovery. And you can see that 90% of the benefit of recovery happens with the first 10 pastures. So why do we continue to split up pastures and go to smaller and smaller or increments of time, shorter grazing periods? It just goes back to all the positive things that happen when we make grazing periods shorter. And a lot of this is tied to how it changes the stock density at which our herds are grazing. But shorter grazing periods give us all of these benefits, and the bottom line of all of those benefits is increased carrying capacity. And increased carrying capacity allows us to increase stocking rate, which raises the revenue stream of the ranch. The key is we need to cost effectively shrink these increments of time. Overstocking and overgrazing are two terms we hear used a lot, and some people think they're the same thing. They're not the same thing. Overstocking is having more animals than the resource will bear. It happens across the entire ranch. And the only way that you fix overstocking is by reducing animal numbers. All right. Overgrazing, on the other hand, happens one plant at a time. And overgrazing very commonly occurs on understocked farms because of the selective grazing that animals are allowed to do in that case. But what overgrazing is biting a plant that's in a negative carbohydrate balance. Negative carbohydrate balance simply means there's more energy being drawn from storage organs moving upward in the plant to support new growth. That's a negative carbohydrate balance. I know it sounds funny to say that energy moving up in the plant is a negative carbohydrate balance. A positive carbohydrate balance, we have more energy moving downward in the plant. We're supporting new plant growth up here, but we have excess energy that can be fed to the storage organs of the plant. Expand the root system, grow down there. So overgrazing happens one plant at a time, and there's two ways that it happens. And those two ways, either the animals stay on the pasture for too long, and so we have growth coming from stored energy that is being bitten off as it comes, or we may have removed the animals from the pasture, but then we brought them back before it was fully recovered, and once again, animals are biting off plants that are drawing on stored energy because they haven't fully recovered. You will note these are both functions of time. It isn't animal number that causes overgrazing. Excess animal numbers causes overstocking, but overgrazing of individual plants is a failure in time management. It's either staying too long or coming back too soon. But the management of time is more important than the management of space. And I'll generally point out of this, when we think about splitting up a pasture into smaller and smaller units, what you really need to be thinking is, I'm creating smaller increments of time. How do I create smaller increments of time? And I think some of you may have broom sedge around here. That also might be mostly east of the sandhill phenomena. But this was several years ago when our son, who's now in, I think this was in 2012, he was managing a place in South Missouri that had a lot of broom sedge. And this was following there was a bad drought in 2012. I think you had some of that in here in Kansas. Focus on what you can control. And if you've been to many of my presentations in the past, I'm sure you've seen one that starts with this, that there's only 4 necessary ingredients for making meat, milk, and fiber, and that's carbon dioxide, solar energy, water, and soil minerals. So these are the inputs that you can control. These are the processes to be focused on in your grazing management. Very often we would describe this as ranching in harmony with nature rather than in opposition to nature. And I've learned that you want to make Mother Nature your business partner because she's the best partner that you can have. And so we work with what are called the ecosystem processes: solar energy flow, water cycle, mineral cycle, biodiversity. Some people would call that community dynamics. But those are things you can control. And it's understanding these processes and managing them that's really the bottom line, or the baseline, the foundation of profitable ranching. If I had a business in town with 100 employees, I would probably have things called position descriptions for those employees so that I know what their job is. Believe it or not, the main point of a position description is not so the employee knows what their job is, so the manager understands what the employee's job is. So these are things that I think a cow should be doing for me as part of her job. Rustle her own grub. Shouldn't be my job to cut and carry feed to her. She's an employee with a job to do. She should be feeding herself. Find the best bite of feed that she can. I shouldn't need to pay a nutritionist, a big sum of money to figure what it's appropriate for my cow to eat, because you know what? She knows exactly what she needs to eat. She just needs to know how to find it. Deliver a live calf every 12 months. It should not be my job to sit out and babysit cows all through the calving season because something might go wrong. I often say, you know what the biggest difference between your daughter and a first calf heifer is? The first calf heifer, you get to pick the boyfriend and you get to pick when they have their first date. If you have problems with cows calving, that's the product of your choice. Usually, see, this is how down I am today. Usually I wouldn't be talking about you in a negative way. I generally only talk about your neighbors that way. If your neighbor has problems calving, it's because your neighbor made the wrong choice about when to let that cow go on a date. Bring a live calf to the weaning pen. She needs to stay healthy without a lot of fuss. way back to that slide early on about functional cows with natural pest resistance, natural fly resistance, all of those things. There are genetically cows who are just better than other cows when it comes to maintaining their own health. That's the kind of cow you want, not a drug addict. Oh, mow weeds, fertilize pastures, plant seeds, till grounds, all these things that my neighbors uses tractor and equipment for. I could get a cow to do those things for me. I just have to create the opportunity. And then a critically important one, come to work every day with a positive attitude. See, all these things here, the cow's supposed to be doing it. That's her job. Now, if the cow's doing all of this stuff, what's the manager's job? Well, in any business, this is my view of the manager's role. Create a working environment where your employees can thrive. It is not the role of a manager to step in front of an employee and do that employee's job. That's not going to be a successful business. If the rancher steps in front of the cow and does the job for the cow, that's not going to be a profitable business. Maintain ranch infrastructure. Never seen a cow tear a fence up and then rebuild the fence. Market ranch products. Don't just throw calves on a trailer and take them to the sale barn. Market your products. And there's a whole lot more products a ranch might market other than just calves. Plan, monitor, adapt, replan. That's the manager's role. I'm not sure why this is right here in this spot. I think we'll see it later on again. But this is to illustrate how ranching as a business has changed. And I will definitely come back to 1973. 1973 is a real significant year. And we'll see several ways that made it a significant year. There's just a couple guys in here who are as old as I am. I remember 1973, and I was kind of looking in from the outside then. We had a cattle cycle peak in 1973, and the price of fed cattle in 1973, that was a record high price, was $54 a hundredweight. Doesn't sound like much compared to the $245 that we saw earlier this summer. I think that's the highest that it got to. You know, there's spots of as an average. Anybody want to hazard a guess if we were to look at consumer price index or inflation adjusted dollars, was the $54 a hundredweight in 1973 a higher price, or is the $245 in 2025 a higher price in terms of real dollars? Anybody want to hazard a guess? What's that? 54 is probably double what the value is today. Doubled? You, sir? 73 price would have had more value. In consume, yeah, right. That's the point, is inflation. In nominal dollars, yeah, this is the highest price we've ever seen. But today's price in value is 62% of what the 1973 cattle price was. 1973 is still the highest cattle prices we have ever seen in America. And we'll come back to this either later today or tomorrow. I think it's tomorrow, and see the real significance of what that means. But in 1973, using the peak price of 1973, a 3/4 ton four-wheel drive pickup costs 20 calves. And then you take the other, tools and stuff to outfit a cowboy. Basically, the annual cost to equip a cowboy was 52 calves. Now, 2023 is not 2025, and the cattle price was not near as high in 2023. I think in what we're going to look at tomorrow, I've adjusted it to the 2025 price. But in 2023, which we thought was going to be a peak of the cattle cycle, but then for 2 more years, it's come on up, 49 calves to pay the cowboy. Even though those calves, were $1,400 a head value, the pickup truck, 71 calves. Now, I find it interesting that in 73, the cost to pay the cowboy, the cost to buy a truck were essentially the same. Here, it's 40% higher for the truck. You know what that says to me? In the intervening 50 years, we put a lot more value on stuff than we do on people. So the total number of calves here, 138. Has the value of his work changed that much in 50 years? Has the usefulness of that pickup changed that much in 50 years to warrant it costing that many more calves? That's why we can't work on a business model that's based in the 1970s. And a whole lot of your neighbors are still operating in a 1970s business model. That's not a good idea. 3 things I learned from ranching for profit, the keys to profitability: improve gross margin. And remember, we're trying to get that to be something greater than 50%. In my experience over all these years, I found the quickest way to increase gross margin is work with nature, not against nature. So we're back to this ranching in harmony with nature and focusing on solar energy flow, water cycle, mineral cycle, biodiversity. Reduce overheads, particularly in small and medium-sized farms and ranches. Overcapitalization in equipment is what I consistently see as one of the biggest killers of ranch viability. We just got too much stuff, and the cows can't afford to pay for all of it. Accelerate turnover rate. Don't get married to your cows. You need to be willing to sell them if the opportunity is right. And something else that Bud Williams used to say, every day you didn't sell something, you bought it. If you're actually in the business on any given day, you should be willing to sell any critter on the place. Margin reminder, this is basically why grazing consistently on a day-to-day basis, it is cheaper to graze cattle than it is to feed them stored feed. And you can just, look down the list. Here, the cow as an employee is doing her job for the most part. Over here, we're doing the cow's job for her, and it costs more money. Takes animal product to pay for that stuff. How much can you really afford to own? Not much. But basically, I use these 3 states because they all start with them and go from the Canadian border, the Garden of Eden of grazing, down to the Gulf Coast. And based on actual producer records, basically they all feed the same amount of hay. We ask why. It's a simple matter of we feed hay to the extent that we can make hay. As we made making hay easier and easier with the equipment, we made more and more hay, and because we have it, we'll feed it. And then the last one here on these 7 is I will have no fear of wasting grass, because there's no such thing as wasted grass. Some of your neighbors, they'll go down, to a pasture and they think that they're going to move the cattle, and they'll get there and they look at where the cattle are standing and say, man, I think I'll leave them there another day. I don't want to waste that grass. So we have, pasture like this across the fence. And we could go over there and graze it to leaving, 4 or 5 inch residual, a lot of green leaf area out there. So recovery is going to come from active photosynthesis, not from stored energy. And recovery from active photosynthesis always happens at a faster rate than recovery from stored energy, basically with the exception of alfalfa. All other forages are pretty well dependent on residual for recovery. Alfalfa is stored carbohydrates. So if we leave that much green leaf behind, it's going to come back quickly. We're keeping the soil covered and cooler so we don't have as much evaporative water loss. The biological functions of the soil are continuing around. We think about the animal and nutrition. The top part of the plant is the most nutritious. The bottom part of the plant is the least nutritious. So if we only ask them to eat partially down into that canopy, their energy intake and total forage intake is going to be higher. So we look at this, and grazing to this point, it's good for the plants, good for the soil, good for the livestock. If, on the other hand, we come out and say, oh, I'll leave them another day, it'll be fine, and we end up at this point, now, very little green leaf, so recovery is going to come from stored energy, so it's going to be a slower process. We've asked the animals to eat deeper into the plant canopy, so their nutrient intake is actually lower. We've exposed more soil to direct sunlight, so we're going to have more evaporative water loss, depending on what the soil temperature gets to. We might have a depression of the beneficial microbial functions. So this kind of grazing is bad for the plants, bad for the soil, bad for the livestock. And it's the fear of wasting grass that pushes us to graze at this point. What this sorts out to, looking at residual height here and daily growth rate, we see that if we leave 4 to 8 inches of grass, basically the response is similar. We're going to have a good recovery rate. It's when we take a bite lower, 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 and we get it down here to 2 inches. This is 50 pounds per acre per day. And so in 40 days, we can grow back a ton of feed. The growth rate down here at just over 30, it takes 64 days to grow a ton of feed. So if we have a 200-day growing season, and we can grow, it takes 64 days to grow a ton of feed, that's just over 3 tons per acre per year. If we can grow a ton in 40 days, that's 5 tons per acre per year. Grass feeds the grass. Grass feeds the soil. Then grass can feed the livestock. If you always go into a pasture with just the mindset of gotta feed the cows, gotta feed the cows, gotta feed the cows, you will run out of grass. You will have disappointing land and animal performance. If you go in understanding that first you take care of the grass, which builds the soil, the livestock will come along for the ride. It's much easier to ensure that you have ample grass to support the animal numbers if you're focused on the grass and the soil, not on the animals. And then the last one here is I will have no fear of wasting grass.